duped. And so we are more likely to become enslaved by the things that we, by the instrumentalities that we have been able to fabricate, than gain a greater measure of freedom. And I want to begin by saying that, yes, indeed, my paper is completely dedicated to the memory of Robin Evans, who was one of those blessed souls who had a gift for that which was invisible, he made visible. Especially for me, in this instant, the point of reference is his article, which was first was a lecture given here, Miss van der Rohe, the paradoxical symmetries, as he called it. And in fact, if those of you remember this article, remember the long meditation on the possible relationship between any of these symmetries, if any, and possible social or political order. I must say that indeed we should all be also grateful to those who organized the conference. The last time that I've been in a comparable occasion was a conference organized by Lampugnani at the Institute of Advanced Study in Berlin, where he managed more or less with Ken Frampton to bring just about anybody who did any work on any of the architects of the 20s and 30s. That was 86. Leibniz was the director of the institute. Those of you who are familiar with German culture know that Leibniz was the editor of the Circumverlag on sociological material, sociological publications. And the issue which underlined all whatever we talked about was underlined by one disturbing issue. And the issue was, were there any necessary relationship between architecture and society and political behavior? Could there be any relationship necessary? And mutatis mutandis, how does it apply to the sociologist? The general thesis in Germany was, and still maintained by some, that, as Adorno said, once we have left, there was no longer sociology in Germany. But Leibniz, at that optimistic moment, waved a Circumverlag paperback saying, well, a young man just has done a thesis on the sociologist under the Nazis and was able to show that, in fact, great work was done in spite of the circumstances, sometimes even by people who were employed officially. And how could we reconcile it, or could we reconcile it? I always try to avoid slides, so I didn't show any examples, but those of you who have been to Stuttgart to see Sterling probably could not avoid the railway station done by Bonatz. Well, Bonatz was one of the bone of contention at that conference. Was he an unknown avant-garde, as Helmut argued, or was he not? On the contrary. And I remember very vividly that one of the arguments put forward in praise of Bonatz was that, after all, he was our father. And therefore we could not ignore him or deny him. I find myself rather disturbed. Some of my colleagues probably find me too often disturbed. But I don't regret it. I think that the only measure by which we can know anything is neither books nor writings, but ourselves in relation to others. And we do know ourselves in relation to others every instant that we try to relate to something other than either ourselves or the others. I think that is why architecture can be so disturbing to the public, And that is, I think, why sculptures and painting can be so disturbing, and perhaps bound to be so. I do not want to expand the thesis on the farm cone and the drag quality, the demigod, those qualities that enable us to pursue such possibilities. But I do remember that if there is something to remember, then it's not the memory, but that which gives rise to it. And so I like to speak by what I consider the predicament in the first part, and the second part, what I consider a possible hope. And I consider hope in part in the footsteps of Daniel Libeskind, to put it so optimistically. In the saying of Heracles, whoever does not hope for the unhoped for will not find it. Whoever does not hope for the unhoped for will not find it. And I think that hope is, of course, standing also in relation to what is just. And unlike some other people, I do believe that we are born with these inalienable gifts, individually born with this inalienable gift of language, gift of rational insight, gift of the knowledge of pain and pleasure, and the gift of love of just world. And I think that if we pursue these gifts, not only we acquire what we can claim to know, and perhaps the only way we can claim to know, but also we are compelled by these gifts, knowing full well that pleasure will never prevail, and just world perhaps will never arrive, and so on. And yet, or trots them in spite of, we must do so. I've traveled recently to many places which made me feel that the subject of our discussion is indeed extremely painful. I was in the Conference of Architecture and Conflict, as the students called it, in Belfast in January. I will be probably next week in Jerusalem. I meet the students at the AA, and I think that those of us who have been here a few years can mark exactly the students that we have and the topics we discuss by the calamities that overcome the world. The first time that Don and Raoul invited me to a unit here, the subject was the lines that divide Beirut. The first students that asked me any question from the graduate school were the students who worked on the consequences of Beirut in terms of the life experience of everyday life, and so on and so forth. I'm far less optimistic and far more disturbed than Paul by what I see. I think England is relatively sheltered in spite of the suffering that is certainly known to many here. But on the whole, the waves of discord, the waves of the sheer terribilitas in Europe, on the continent, on the whole, is not really felt. We live in a world which is happy to bask in its own ignorance. Iraq. I just spent the morning reading a book on the Arabs of the marshland. Most of you probably never heard of the architecture of the marshland. but they exist. I completely deny and disagree with the description of the world as something so uniform and so repetitive, and with so little differences that perhaps not worth defending. I have no trust in the multiplication of television channels and so on, because as we know, the media replicate itself, nothing else. It's a thesis that in fact propagated very expertly by a man called Harold Innis, whose first studies was on the effects of the railway in Canada, and subsequently produced his studies in a book called Empires in Communication, in which he traced the relationship between the mode of communication, writings, inscriptions, letters, forms, and so on, and the type of political life. In fact, McLuhan, who's probably better known, has written somewhere that all his work is a footnote to Harold Innis. I will not try to compete with Harold Innis, but I will, even if I don't read it, I will remind you of St. John Perrin's Anabasis and the essential nomadic nature of all human existence in different forms. I would say that my neighbor in the country, Monsieur Pierre, who doesn't read a paper and probably have read very few books in his life, probably represent and embodies what I would call the closest proximity to what we can all aspire to understand or to know as culture. I wonder whether he will die before anybody will be able to learn from him what he knows about apples, about nuts, about rabbits, about where to cut the wood from which you can make a tool for the different tools, how to read the movement of the air among the leaves. I think that we are in great danger of losing the respect for the differences and for the particularities which characterize human life when they are democratically lived. In France, modernity had become a religion. People talk about space and places and centers as if the country was a desert and needed to be repopulated. There's an excellent comic film by Eric Romer, which is called The Architect, the Mediathèque, and the Tree, which just opened in Paris, which caricature this phenomenon. We often see in our schools and in our architecture discussions, we look at such monuments like the IMA, Institut Mont Arabe, we forget what it is. It is an empty place, in part. It is a place that suffered from neglect. It is a place that doesn't work because the political will is not behind it. In spite of the architect's effort, soon we will look at, or here the AA already looked at Monsieur Bousquet's effort in Nîmes. In Arles next door, Soriani just opened, not yet opened, but finished more or less, a new museum for Roman archaeology. Every little town tried to give a semblance of what they feel the Beaubourg has done in Paris. And what the Beaubourg has done in Paris is not yet, cannot be so simply told. and nor would I try it tonight, but I just want to, this afternoon, I just want to propose it as problematic rather than as a good answer, as a good response. I think symbolically the intervention of the Minister of Culture and Communication, as it is called, over there, and by now it's the Minister of Culture, Communication and Education, maybe not for a very long time. We saw the new project for the library next to the IMA. This is one of half a dozen of projects that Mr. Lang tried to pass through in the last weeks of his regime. But in his early weeks of his regime, we can see exactly the intervention. We can see exactly how the rules of the game laid down. And one of the key monuments in this context is the Palais Royal. Those of you who know Palais Royal, Senat has written not only theoretical discussion of Palais Royal, but also a novel called Palais Royal, which is no doubt the last masterpiece of the old regime. Now, the Mitterrand regime made its mark, certainly, is taking a good part of it and making it into a sculpture by Daniel Byrne. Now, this sculpture looks as perfectly as it were a democratic intervention in this space. By the way, it also has a cross, two crosses, in fact, in the ground plan of this sculpture. But by bringing the street patterns into these Palais Royal enclosures, the river is here, the palace itself, Minister of Culture, Education, and so on. This intervention, I think, could be taken as a resume of what this recent regime has tried to establish. But bearing in mind these questions that I began with, we are, in fact, witnessing a tremendous human movement of multitudes of human beings across continent. Physically, it is contained. An enormous effort is made to contain it. But when you travel slowly, preferably by train, by bus, and so on, from Vienna to Prague, from Prague to Moscow, from Moscow to Riga, from Moscow back to New Delhi, you see masses and masses of people who have lost some certainties and have gained none others, and find it very difficult to retain their composure under these circumstances. In October, I sat at a table with the Dalai Lama, who used his Nobel Prize Peace fortune to establish a foundation for the study of what he called universal responsibility. Or better still, this particular meeting was on the subject of education for universal responsibility. The most important thing that he managed to convey in that meeting was that he knew that we knew that he knew that we knew that there are other things in heaven and earth that neither he nor us know, which are probably more important than we were able to say or even think. And he did it by laughing, bursting in great laughter every so often. I feel that in architecture what I call the Unorigin of Space. And here I come to my second part. There is, I feel, a way in which that kind of challenge can be met, even in only partial form. It can be met from time to time if one can attend to what I call the unorigin of space. If one can apply the epoche, meaning the bracketing, distancing, if one can renew the moment in which the material, the putting together of things gives itself, and renew that otherness that I referred to early on. Yes, I think that we have attempted to build a tower long enough, and we can turn to the foundation. That doesn't mean that I suggest that we can have a foundation myth. That simply means, I'm just looking for my other piece of paper, in which I try to summarize this possibility. I think we are faced with the Caliban predicament when he reproached Prospero in Shakespeare's Tempest, when he says, "You taught me language, and my profit on't is, I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language." I think that figures, structures, are a memories of the flesh, where what has not yet been written is inscribed. What has no discourse to wrap itself in, what has not yet been born into language, what has a place, has taken a place, but has no language. The felt, that which expresses itself for the first time, declares itself to us often in silence. These pleasures and pains, at a distance, place within a parenthesis of the unthought, which separate and delineate the surface against the horizons of height and depth, are creatures of the surface, objects of the depths. Heracles is stranded relative to these ruins of the infernal abyss, the unreachable interiors of lead-cladded figures. The celestial height, the unmeasurable distance of the beyond, and the surface of the earth, from which our figures, our structures figure, rises from and return to it. On earth, we come across frightening combinations and confrontations. On earth, the architect is a pacifier and surveyor. He who always ascend or descend to the surface in every conceivable manner. Reality is not. It has to be searched for and to be won. It is a definition of the human body to appropriate in indefinite series of discontinuous acts, seeds of significance, which outgrow and transfigure its natural powers. He who brings back between heaven and hell the serpent of hell and the celestial serpent. It is the architect and the painter and the sculptor and the poet, for whom it is no longer a question of Dionysic magic and wisdom down below, or Apollonian power and artifice up above, but Heracles of the surface, in his dual battle against both depth and height, reorientating thought and charting a new geography. Not unlike the hero of Stoic tragedies, these structures do not distract us with likeness. They have no distinctive feature. They make us aware of the whole and parts. They invite our particularity. Our souls are invited to dwell in these bodies, our weightlessness to dwell in their weight, our light to equal their darkness. What we can not see in them finds its voice in what we can see in them. There are cases that enclose space just as our body does. Indeed, architecture occupies a place in the world just as our bodies do, but it does not exist in the same way. Our bodies are the ones instrumentalities for knowing and things known, hold the dual role of subject and object. Structures are the objects that enable architecture, when it is architecture and not buildings. They are the objects that enable us to transcend our peculiar position in the world. They recover and uncover for us the knowledge of things as they are in human experience. As well as Stevens writes in The Man with the Blue Guitar, where do I begin and end? And where, as I strum the thing, do I pick up that which momentously declares itself not to be I, and yet must be? It could be nothing else. In order to enter deep into the confidence of things, these things with essential life we want to reproduce, we must be free in order that they will speak to us. We must take a thing through a certain time as the only one that exists, as the only phenomenon which through our diligent and exclusive love finds itself set down in the center of the universe, and which in this incomparable place on that day the angels serve. Perhaps when architecture does exist, it exists in a dimension close to Hermann Broch's sense of time, not as an inner sense, but on the contrary, time as it assumes the true function that is ordinarily ascribed to space, time as the innermost external world. That is the sense by which the external world is given to us internally. This externality, which manifests itself inwardly, does not belong to the real make-up of the ego nucleus any more than the death, locked through death, is within life, following it out life from inside and belonging to it as such. The last sentence is, of course, Arendt's comment on Broch's sense of internal time. In a period in which external collective reality is incapable of providing an otherness which resides in external objects of experience, the boundaries of one's identity are less free in allowing the movement from internal to external reality and vice versa. The boundary itself becomes the focus. The membrane itself, la pelle, the skin, separate an object from its not being. In this analogy between the object and the body is alive and the body is a thing, is to be pursued. A caesura between collective and individual experience is established when transgression is no longer ritualized in an acceptable cultural form. The boundary surfaces themselves become the site of an elaboration of working through of the conflict. a predicament noted in Kafka's penal colony, a society in which there are no other means of internalizing the law but to inscribe it in the skin and flesh by the penal colony machine. Some of us always felt continuities that have nothing in common with the course of history. It is an open space that provokes new interpretations and evoke in its incompleteness the void on which the work depends. This void is the unnameable, nameless, on which the transition of the perceptible thing to a vision depends. Sometimes our own body is our ready-made. The irony of a singular choice, which is in the course of fulfilling itself, its unique particularity, become an anonymous vessel, or better still, a synonymous figure, the figure as a mask. Even Anteos, the giant son of Poseidon and Gaia, the sea and the earth, who compelled all comers to wrestle with him and be killed when overcome, was defeated and killed by Heracles. Anteos was made strong through contact with his mother, the earth. Heracles lifted Anteos from the earth. As if the body has to be lifted away from the earth before it can be felt, in order for what is carved to be carved from the inside and to be led increasingly to the outside, away from the expression of the inside, toward the material alien to the self. The inner measures are incorporated into the carving, and the will to form that reason to the surface endows our life with its shape in time. I think I could go on, but I prefer to stop here and to open it to question. Otherwise, I think I will slip into other people's space of time.
Okay, then thanks so much indeed, Yehuda. So much. Okay, I'd now like to introduce Elizabeth Wilson, who's going to give the next paper. Elizabeth.
I'm afraid this paper may be a bit incoherent because I'm really trying to get from one place to another in a sense. I mean, theoretically, not literally. And really the main point of it comes at the end. And it's just a question really about how we should conceptualise the division between public and private. And that really comes, as I say, at the end. And before that, I'm just going to undertake a fairly standard description of the development of the 19th and 20th century city. The only slightly unusual feature about it being really that I shall be emphasising the relationship of women to the city mainly. But just before I do that, I'd like to just start by saying something about the public and the private, just something very basic and simple that I'm sure you're all familiar with. I just want to remind you of it, to remind you of the way in which there were a number of major 19th century philosophers and theorists who built their philosophies around the assumption of a very clear distinction between the public and the private. Hegel, for example, his whole scheme of things, insofar as I understand it, which is not to any great extent, I have to say, is built around this distinction, and it's very highly genderized in Hegel. So there is a whole body of theory that equates the public with the masculine and the private with the feminine. And it's been suggested that contemporary feminism, or the feminism of the 70s, the 1970s, instead of challenging, really reproduced that division, accepted that that was the case, and even kind of reinforced the idea by building its own overarching trans-historical theory of something called patriarchy. So I just want to remind you of that, and I'll come back to the issue at the end of my talk. I first of all want to say something about the city as it develops in the 19th century, and how do women relate to this new industrial city. Now, one of the important things about the 19th century city, of course, is the crowd, and there are all sorts of hundreds of visual and literary representations of the crowd. There are very glittering representations of the crowd in joyous paintings by Renoir, Manet, and so on and so on. And women you do see women are represented there, though in a very particular, and some would argue a very highly sexualized way. But at least the crowd as thus represented represents joy, vitality, and so on. But there's another more sinister side to the crowd. Engels and Edgar Allan Poe and other writers write of the uncanniness of the crowd, the horror of the crowd, the indifference, the alienation of the crowd. Georg Simmel, for example, I'll come back to him in a minute. Equally, the crowd might be experienced as uncivilized, unclean, and dangerous. This is a different sort of city from earlier kinds of city. This is a city with a developed, I suppose one should say, proletariat, really, a new kind of urban crowd. But although on the one hand it might be or might become a more organized crowd, and that's very frightening as well, it's often described in feminine terms, as hysterical, carried away by emotion, or as in images of feminine instability, liquidity, swampiness, and so on, which all have engulfing, suffocating, which all have kind of feminine connotations. And of course, more generally, this crowd sort of bursts out and it's uncontrollable in a new sort of way. Of course, by the 19th century, Baroque conceptions of the orderly, open, spectacular city are very much available and in circulation. And yet the great cities of the 19th century didn't seem to fit this blueprint, but to have become just too large, too dirty, the haunt of criminals, the sexually deviant or the degenerate. And as a dangerously proliferating and uncontrolled space, the 19th and early 20th century city is subject to concentrated governmental intervention and reordering and regulation. Although perhaps initially, perhaps before that, comes a whole series of literary representations of utopian cities which are designed to do away with all the evil effects of cities and to order people more carefully and more completely. And of course, in Britain certainly, a number of philanthropic communities of that kind were built by philanthropic industrialists such as Sir Titus Salt at Saltaire in Yorkshire, or Port Sunlight, built by the Unilevers. But of course, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the most influential alternatives that was designed and put into effect was Ebenezer Howard's design for the Garden City. That would be one way by which this swamp must be drained. And perhaps before I talk a little bit about that, I would just like to remind you of one particular writer who does talk very much in terms of all the filthy and evil aspects of cities as being feminine in an extraordinarily explicit way. And that is the French hygienist Alexandre Parent du Châtelet, who I believe he actually designed the drainage system in Paris and certainly wrote a great deal about it. Victor Hugo's famous sequence about in the sewers in Les Miserables was based on one of Parent du Châtelet's books. And then Parent du Châtelet also wrote a very influential book about prostitutes in Paris. And in that book, he actually describes, he says, well, I wasn't contaminated when I looked at drains, so I hope people won't feel I'm being contaminated now that I'm investigating this even more unpleasant kind of drain, viz. Prostitutes. And so that's a very clear example of the way in which a particular kind of women and prostitutes were very much associated with cities. The prostitute was regarded as actually a drain. The prostitute was necessary in a way because she drained away excess male lust and so on, male desires, but at the same time she was a source of infection, as sewage might be. And so that's really a pretty nasty kind of metaphor, but I think it's quite a significant one. But cities like, or garden cities like Letchworth and Welwyn Garden City, the two that were most closely based on Ebenezer Howard's ideas and work, were meant to demonstrate the benefits of having much smaller, more carefully planned cities of livable proportions. These cities were to be notable for having wiped out slums, crime and poverty. They would have done away with all that was negative about urban life, crime, drunkenness and so on. But their positive vision of what the ideal city should be like, I mean, I'm sure this is all very familiar to you, but I just want to go through it, was very conservative. Although Letchworth included a few dwellings designed for semi-collective living, the distinction between private and public was not challenged, and a kind of enhanced domesticity was to be an important part of these cities, and that was sort of symbolized in a way by the cottagey architecture, which harked back to medieval village styles and so on. And I think it's interesting, actually, Paul reminded me yesterday evening that we talk all about sink estates and tower blocks and all that sort of thing, but some of the worst sink estates today are in fact what were built, estates that were built on garden city lines. There was one that he made me remember in Leicester in the late 60s called the Braunston Estate, which was a garden city, a garden suburb, a council garden suburb, which was the repository of the whole of the underclass of Leicester that time. And today, Moulscombe in Brighton, outside Brighton, where you may remember the two little girls were murdered a few years ago, is also, that is the sink estate of Brighton. But when it was built, it was called the Garden City by the Sea, and it was meant to be the absolutely ideal sort of living situation for a rather privileged group of working class people. And having said that, I think it's interesting that Letchworth and Hampstead Garden Suburb, to an extent, in their early days, did attract a more bohemian group of people, including independent single women. A quite different kind of experiment, much more limited experiment, in New York, and possibly other American cities, I'm not sure, but certainly in New York, where were hotels and apartment blocks designed for partly communal living. And these were hotels or apartments in which, again, artistic and literary people, bachelors of both sexes, did live a different kind of more bohemian life. But life on her own in a large city was always more difficult for a woman than for a man. And I think in the 19th century, at any rate, women were the bearers of much of the anxiety surrounding city life in general. And perhaps that's partly because the female body represented, came to stand in for, the private in public space. This enormous 19th century preoccupation with prostitution suggests that at some level a woman in public, and of course prostitutes were referred to as public women, acted for the Victorians as a living representation of sexuality, something that ought to have been hidden, should have been hidden. Women were their bodies, and whereas a feminine body in a rural landscape was seemly and appropriate, since women were closer to nature anyway, a woman in the public spaces of the city was a threat and a danger. She was a matter in the wrong place. And of course the private sphere was elaborated and expanded in the, earlier than the 19th century, but by this time it had been elaborated. And since women stood for the emotions and for the private and for an individualized response to life, their presence in the public sphere of the street, the park, or the theatre could be cause for alarm. If they were seen as less moral, as more amoral and so on than men, then that eroded and contaminated public morality in some fundamental way. So, in theory, at any rate, women were locked into the private sphere. But of course, in practice, women did participate in urban life. They did go onto the streets, particularly working class women flocked through the districts in which they lived and worked. And also, and perhaps more interestingly, the 19th century consumer society created all sorts of intermediate zones which blurred the lines between public and private, spatially speaking. Perhaps the most important for middle-class women, but also for the women who worked in it. Whole new groups of women are coming into work in the civil service and in retailing and so on. Perhaps one of the most important was the department store. But there was also the public library, the restaurant, the cafe, the hotel lobby, and even the office. All these spaces were theoretically public, and yet in many cases they aimed to recreate a private zone. The department store was like a private home. Somebody called a floor walker, an imposing man, sort of as it were a butler, like a butler, greeted you at the door and showed you to the counter you wanted to go to and sat you down and introduced you to the sales assistant who would actually serve you and so on. There was a kind of, it was a kind of imitation of a private mansion, just as the cafe was like a salon. Siegfried Kracauer called the cafe a home for the homeless. Meanwhile, the relationship between boss and secretary was a sort of pale replica of marriage, or in some cases an actual replica of marriage. And Henry James, when he went back to New York at the beginning in 1907, was very taken. He was very interested in the hotel in particular. He says that the hotel's a kind of complete scheme of life. It's a kind of mirror of life, an imitation of life. And he made the important point that although somewhere like the Waldorf Astoria, again, looks like this wonderful private mansion, in order to participate in the life of the hotel, to be waited on by its servants and so on, you had only to have sufficient money. Unlike the private house, it wasn't actually exclusive. Your entree to a hotel didn't depend on your knowing the owners, being invited. So breeding and friendship didn't enter into it, and the guest was only a customer in these fake mansions. Henry James's friend Edith Wharton, the novelist, also in The House of Mirth, dwells on the moral ambiguity of the hotel environment and links it explicitly with the presence of women. And again, Siegfried Kragkauer in the 20s writes of the hotel lobby as the home of the private detective, that anonymous man of the crowd. Again, the private detective, the private eye, is a kind of homeless person with no relationships and no real sort of dwelling place. He's a loiterer, flaneur, if you like. And loitering is legitimate in the hotel lobby. Though, of course, women would find it more difficult to loiter without being suspected of being prostitutes. But, of course, women were in all or many of these places, and this in itself contributed to the blurring of the line between public and private. Georg Simmel described the way in which money becomes the universal means of circulation of value, but is a sort of colourless medium itself, divested of all moral content or of all qualities of any kind. And the indifference of money is a very well-worked theme. The circulation of women in the streets had the opposite effect, to make them morally ambiguous and tainted. And if money is a colourless medium, and its circulation part of what blurred the division of public and private ultimately, by creating commercial zones which provided phony privacy and so on. The presence of women stained once again the fluidity of street life. And as James noticed, the truth at the heart of urban life is a kind of immense promiscuity in the widest sense of the word. Partly, of course, that promiscuity consists of the circulation of hundreds and thousands of bodies in often confined spaces without personal or physical contact. I mean, we have all developed, people who live in cities have developed, without even probably being aware of it, a capacity not to bump into people, or if you are forced into close contact with people, as in a crowded tube train, there is a whole repertoire of acts whereby there is a total disavowal that you actually are pressed up against somebody's chest. You know, you look over there, look up there, no eye contact must occur, and so on. And you disassociate yourself from it sort of emotionally and morally. And this is an extraordinary, elaborate sort of quadrille of physical avoidance. And I suppose it's part of what Simmel calls the Blase Attitude and so on. But Simmel, of course, and many others thought the Blase Attitude, or however they described it, as dangerous because it's essentially amoral. Perhaps it's the attitude of the sort of the super sophisticate who simply observes and never makes judgments other than possibly aesthetic ones. So I suppose by being blasé, that's one way you removed yourself from the more sordid aspects of the spectacle. But of course the other way of coping with it is to draw the line ideologically more firmly and rigidly between the public and the private, precisely because in practice that line is blurred. And yet women's relationship to this, I mean, I'm repeating myself in a way, is still an uneasy one. Because even in these safe spheres, such as the department store and so on, she is an object of consumption as well as a consumer. and has been seen as being cast in the role more of someone to be looked at than someone to look. Her body decorated with garments which draw attention to it, rather than rendering it more uniform, as is more the case with male fashions. Her body's too much on display and disrupts this flowing, colourless and all-embracing promiscuity through which she kind of swims, as it were. And there is a debate really amongst feminists as to whether that the way in which women did negotiate the city in the 19th century and continued to do so does represent an increase of independence and autonomy for women, or whether in a sense men are still, or patriarchy or whatever you want to call it, is still controlling women, only this time through consumption, so that there's an argument which runs that really women are again seduced by all this consumption. They are enticed and incited, but still the producers of all the goods are in control. That's a view that's been made by someone called Rita Felsky. I think I and Judith Volkovits, who's written recently about London in the late 19th century, would tend to take rather the more optimistic view. But I think it's the more, the view of urban life as alienated, the kind of Georg Simmel view. I think that this view very much caught the imagination of planners and of many city dwellers. And as I'm sure you know, in the 20th century, withdrawal, first to the suburbs, more recently to smaller satellite towns, and even to revamped villages, or to sort of nowhere places, particularly perhaps in the United States, has been the answer to the threat of paranoia, the sort of paranoia that urban life induced. And there's been a gradual abandonment of city centres as people have gone off into these sort of urban regions and left the city centres, which have become, I think, very contradictory spaces in a way. I think they tend to be represented as highly masculinized spaces. There was an article in a Sunday newspaper here recently about Manchester, the sort of drug gangland character of certain estates in Manchester, Moss Side. Actually, I think it's in Hume. He got it all wrong, actually, I think. But and this article described this representation, quasi-fictional representation, I think, really, represented a world in which it was completely colonized by men, by black pimps and drug dealers. It was an extremely sort of racist representation, really. And the picture that was drawn by a novelist actually called Gordon Byrne was, and I think this really was part of a novel. I don't think it was, well, I happened to go to Manchester the following week and they said this is all rubbish, so, but perhaps that was just sort of Mancunian pride, I don't know really. But it was represented, Moss Side was represented as a totally male space in which nobody lives there except these sort of men toting guns and going into abandoned houses to smoke crack or whatever they do. And a prostitute, briefly appeared in this narrative for about 2 seconds, and that was it. And I think Mike Davis, when he talks about the ghettos of East LA and so on, also represents them as a highly masculine space. And yet, of course, these kind of areas in cities tend to be inhabited predominantly by very poor, often black or old women, by single parents and old age pensioners, mainly women, who are trapped and can't get out. So there's a curious paradox about the way in which those areas are represented and what is actually happening in them. Now I think, I'm sort of leaping on really, but I think that now, in recent years, the whole, I mean, obviously in the early 20th century there has been an enormous, certainly in Britain, an enormous social engineering project to do away with slums and all these unpleasant aspects of life like prostitution and drinking and so on. And I think that architecture has, again, I'm sure this will be a very familiar idea, architecture has had to carry the can, really, for all these ills. Somehow if you have different kind of houses and they're in a different place, it'll all be all right. All these nasty things will go away. You know, I think that is all about sort of regulation and surveillance. And I think that women, again, have been a particular focus of all these anxieties. It was slum mothers or working mothers, sluttish mothers, and so on, who were seen to be the problem very often. I think that to some extent has not vanished, but it has attenuated now. That my feeling is that in a sense the genie is out of the bottle. It's sort of recognised that women are not in just in the private sphere, that they are out there, so that although their presence in public may be unwelcome, or it may not be seen as safe, the whole discourse, I think, has changed. I mean, I'm not going to argue that through, but that would be my feeling. There's now a different kind of anxiety about urban spaces, or urban, or the postmodern city, or whatever you want to call it, of which I think Frederick Jameson's work is a very colourful example, in a sense. Jameson has argued influentially, I'm not sure if correctly, but very influentially, that there is a new kind of schizoid horror in the kind of Silicon Valley sort of architecture, places that are neither cities nor they're not, certainly not the countryside. There is some sort of horrible intermediate, sort of ambiguous space. But our reaction to it, to what is objectively, or he implies objectively, hideous, and it's full of sort of wrecked cars and sort of horribleness of all kinds of pollution, the reaction is a kind of peculiar pleasure. We somehow draw some kind of aesthetic attractiveness out of this, and also he talks a lot about affectlessness, a kind of schizoid reaction, a kind of blank smile to this new horror. And he sees also the sort of eclipse of nature itself, though I would tend to disagree with that. I don't have time to talk about that, but I think that in itself is also, I think, a very romantic kind of notion. I mean, it implies something else that ought to be there. But I think this new vision of the contemporary city or region, and particularly the contemporary American city, as a kind of hell, a sort of postmodern hell, is now quite an influential way in which urban space is represented. And I think Mike Davis, in his account of contemporary LA, is another example of that, not quite such a florid example. But it brings me back, what he says about LA, which I think is very interesting, will bring me back to my initial but also my final point. He speaks of the new ghettos as carceral society as prison. And he describes the way in which the LA ghettos have become war zones in the manner of Vietnam. He quotes police chief, or perhaps it's ex-police chief now, I'm not quite sure, Daryl Gates, as saying, we're out to get them, talking about the gangsters or whatever's supposed to be out there. This is Vietnam here in LA. And then Mike Davis comments on this The them, what a local mayor calls the Viet Cong abroad in our society, are the members of local black gangs, segmented into several hundred fighting sets, and so on. In the official version, which Hollywood is incessantly recreating and further sensationalizing, these gangs comprise veritable urban guerrilla armies organized for the sale of crack and outgunning the police with huge arsenals. So presumably this is what Gordon Byrne was trying to do for Manchester. Although, actually, Mike Davis says, gang cohorts are typically hardly more than high school kids, but local politicians frequently compare them to the murderous militias of Beirut, so a very powerful kind of rhetoric is built up. Meanwhile, of course, he also describes the privatized sections of posh Beverly Hills and all the outlying desirable residential areas where space has been totally privatized. The roads are private, often gated, patrolled by private armed guards, and so on. And then there's a third aspect of space in LA, which he describes as the sort of dead center, with just corporate buildings and a sort of another kind of sort of fortress environment. And he argues that the net result is the destruction of accessible public space. He says, the contemporary opprobrium attached to the term street person is itself a harrowing index of the devaluation of public spaces. To reduce contact with these untouchables, urban redevelopment has converted once vital pedestrian streets into traffic sewers, and here's sewers again, and transformed public parks into temporary receptacles for the homeless and the wretched. The American city is being systematically turned outside in, or rather inside, it's being systematically turned inside out, or rather outside in. The valorized spaces of the new megastructures and super malls are concentrated in the center, that's inside the structure. Street frontage is denuded. Public activity is sorted into strictly functional compartments, and circulation is internalized in corridors under the gaze of private police. And then he goes on to talk about our traditional sense of privacy and the private sphere also being, while these new kinds of phony public privacy are being created, the private sphere is increasingly breached by electronic surveillance, databases, and subscription cable services. And so he says it no longer makes sense to talk about the public-private in the old way. And yet he seems to, he implies, he takes a sort of libertarian attitude to this invasion by electronic surveillance and so on. There's an assumption that this violates a privacy which should be preserved. But I think we ought to think about that. Is that the case? The local authority in the Isle of Dogs in London's Dockland installed semi-private electronic surveillance in an attempt to prevent racist attacks against the Bangladeshi community, which is something we presumably might wish to support. And of course there have been many demands from feminists, particularly from women, for direct breaches in the privacy of the domestic sphere by the state. And feminists have insisted on revealing the extent of hidden domestic violence by men against women and against children, sexual abuse and so on. These long hidden, shameful acts have had to be brought to light. And one result has been increasing state intervention in the privacy of the family. That's a long-term trend, of course. And then I just want to point out that meanwhile there are a whole series, then I've nearly finished, a whole series of literary, filmic and artistic obsessions also with showing everything. So that we have become quite accustomed to no-holds-barred descriptions and depictions of sexual acts, though actually often the way in which they're depicted is highly conventionalized. Nevertheless, there is an attempt or a kind of effort to suggest sex in very explicit ways. novels such as Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, or Helen Zahavi's Dirty Weekend, which is a revenge novel in which a woman goes about getting men to have sex with her and then she kills them all. A lot of feminists like that. I can't say I liked it very much myself. Then there are artists such as Jeff Koons who create kitsch representations of sexual intercourse. And of course films routinely contain torrid sex scenes and so on. I mean, I'm not saying I object to any of this, but I think it's interesting. I'm not quite sure why it seems so important in popular culture and what we think of as high art, as why there is this compulsion, why it is necessary for people to do that. Why is it important that we should see everything, or we should be given the illusion that we are seeing everything, and and that nothing is veiled? And such representations certainly constitute a transgression of the public-private divide, and are intended to do so when Jeff Koons, again, for example, depicts himself and his wife having sexual intercourse. Changes in fashion also play with the transgression of this boundary, so that underwear is now outerwear and so on. And nobody feels at all shocked at seeing a woman going about in a corset, which would have been thought very strange up until about 10 years ago. And there's a crossover between fetish wear, which was also very private, and mainstream fashion, so that leather, rubber, and even more bizarre things, not that I suppose rubber is particularly bizarre, but is routinely used, and you see ads for it in the Tatler and so on. So if it's true that postmodernism inaugurates a new experience of the world as fragmented, and that the postmodern sensibility breaks down divisions of all kinds, then we shouldn't be surprised, I suppose, if it breaches whatever it is, if it breaches the public-private divide, bringing in public sex and private streets, open prisons and closed parks, cities in the countryside and urban deserts. Now, just my last point, Martin Jay, in a very interesting article on Foucault, argued that the Enlightenment privileged looking and the ocular. Sight was considered the most noble of the senses, but Jay argues that in the 20th century this has been reversed, and the dominance of vision has become suspect in Foucault's work as elsewhere, causing paranoia, suspicions of voyeurism, and a rejection of the mastery that sight once implied. To look and to see was part of the mastery that science claimed, dissection of the body being one of its most controversial aspects at one period. But today we've also become suspicious of science and its claims. And yet the gaze has become even more important in an image-dominated culture. Some feminists would argue that the voyeurism of visual culture today places the female body as even more the object of the gaze than ever before. Judy Volkovits prefers to stress, as I think I do, as I said, the ambiguity of meaning created by female display, which isn't necessarily passive, and women look as well as being looked at. The ambiguities of contemporary space may suggest the disintegration of our traditional ways of ordering our culture, and a profound change does seem to be underway. At the moment, we seem to demand and are able to see more and more, yet instead of producing the enlightenment confidently expected by 18th and 19th century scientists, our seeing does seem to produce fear and paranoia. The answer of the early 20th century town planners to child cruelty, sexual murder, crime and drunkenness was perfectly regulated, designed and ordered urban space. But this solution in its turn is now perceived to have failed. But now, instead of the crowd being what we fear, I think it is the emptiness. I mean, this is really a different point, actually, but I will just end on it. Doesn't really entirely follow on, but I just want to say it. Now what we're afraid of is not the crowd in the streets, but I think the emptiness of the streets. It's because streets are empty that women are afraid to go into them, and indeed men as well. And yet, just to end on the more optimistic sort of Judy Volkovic's kind of point, women as well as men do still continue to negotiate urban spaces successfully. And I think there are now, I perhaps feel that in the 90s there are more new ideas about how to recreate perhaps smaller urban spaces within larger cities in a way that would make them more livable. So I'll just stop on that point.
Okay, does anyone have any questions?
It seems very difficult. He's got a question.
So,
Richard Sennett wrote a book called The Fall of the
Yes,
Man.
yeah.
Are you describing the fall of private need?
Well, I hadn't thought of it like that, but why not, really? Yes, I mean, that's an interesting idea, isn't it? I mean, I've never thought of it like that, though, of course, I've read the book. I think I was quite influenced
So
by
are
it.
these women fallen?
Well, to an extent, we've lost that concept, haven't we? You know, the sort of distinction doesn't exist in the same way as it did. And perhaps it never existed in quite the way that it was supposed to exist. But I think that's part of what causes a sort of, you know, is causing a moral panic. Nobody knows who is a respectable woman or not anymore. You know, that's one marker, that social marker that has been lost or abandoned. I think.
Are you then seeing the direct comparability or mappability from the ambiguity of women's status to the ambiguity of private public space?
Well, I think they have been so much mapped onto each other that it's almost hard not to, in a way. But I mean, there's much more you could say about that, because I mean, you know, there are hundreds of different trends you could talk about. I mean, you could talk about the return of the office to the home. You know, I mean, one trend that's said to be occurring is that more and more couples will work at home. They may have separate jobs, but they'll be working at home. So, you know, that is a completely, you know, that is another way in which things are changing, and we don't know quite what will be the result of that. You're rather claustrophobic, I would have thought. You know, so, you know, there's an extremely complex series of things that are happening. That,
one account of violence might be that, in fact, there's a great deal of space which seems to be neither public nor private, and that it's precisely that instability that is dangerous.
what sort of spaces?
Well, a great deal of urban space seems to be, I mean, it's not public in the sense that an Italian piazza was public.
No.
And it's certainly not private either. Simply, it's the problem of defensible space that often
Yeah. Well, but most violence towards women does still occur in the home, though. That's overwhelmingly where women operate, actually. So, I mean, you know, women are frightened to go out, but actually they're much less likely to be attacked in any way outside than they are inside. So I suppose to that extent the public-private divide is still very much in existence. And I don't know, that wasn't perhaps quite...
Are there any more points? I mean, I have a sense that some of these issues will come up in the discussion at the end of the conference.
Yeah,
so
actually, yeah.
it may be a good idea to take it then. I also kind of have the sense that maybe it would be a good idea now to take a break, shall we say, for a quarter of an hour, so that people might get themselves a coffee. So if we could start at 3:45, when Andrew Benjamin will give his paper, and then there will be a round table discussion.